Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. I'm so glad you're here. Today, I want to talk about two of my favorite subjects, serial killers and obscure true crime cases. There are so many serial killers that do not get much media attention, and I like focusing on those killers because, one, we haven't heard all the stories 100 times, and two, every victim matters and every killer can teach us something about the psychology of why they do what they do. I can't promise you that you've never heard of these killers because I know you are true crime connoisseurs, but I hope I can give you a little new information today on the topic I know that we're all interested in. These are 5 serial killers you've never heard of. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Gary and Thaddeus Lewingdon were brothers born in the late 1930s in Ohio. Little is known about their childhoods, but we know they went to college, and we know that Gary, who was the younger brother, enlisted in the Army and served in Vietnam. Gary struggled after the war and was arrested for things like theft and lewd behavior on a regular basis. Thaddeus went through a divorce in 1977, and this is when he decided to convince his younger brother to go into a life of crime with him. The two brothers concocted a plan to start burglarizing stores and homes in order to make money. Their first crime was committed on December 10th, 1977. The brothers drove from Ohio to Newark, New Jersey. They wanted to commit all of their crimes far from home because they thought they would be less likely to get caught if no one in the area knew who they were. They walked into a bar where 38-year-old Joyce Vermillion and 33-year-old Karen Dodrill were working. They were the only two people in the bar at the time. The brothers shot Joyce and Karen multiple times. Joyce died at the scene, and Karen died months later from complications of the shooting and surgeries. She actually died on her 34th birthday. I hate that. Just two women at work trying to make money, and they get killed for it. On February 13th, 1978, the brothers broke into the home of 52-year-old Robert McCann, who owned a nightclub in Franklin County, Ohio. They shot Robert, they shot his 77-year-old mother, Dorothy, and they shot his 26-year-old girlfriend, Christine Hardman. All 3 people were killed instantly. A few weeks later, the brothers attacked 77-year-old Jenkins Jones, shooting him and 4 of his dogs before stealing money and valuables from his house. Their next victim was a 35-year-old priest, Gerald Fields, who had hardly anything to take. The brothers were ruthless, they were vicious, and they engaged in overkill. Most of their victims were shot between 10 and 17 times. That is just enjoyment at that point. There is absolutely no reason to shoot someone that many times. It's sadistic. In May of 1978, Gary and Thaddeus committed a double murder, killing 47-year-old Jerry Martin and his wife Martha. Jerry was the vice president of a company called Permastone, and he made a nice living. Gary and Thaddeus walked up to the Martin home and executed Jerry and his wife, shooting them through the window of the living room. These people were sitting in their chairs in their living room and were shot through the window. They never even knew what was coming. The brothers then entered the house and stole valuables. Police investigators were able to perform a ballistics examination of the bullets and the casings at this particular crime scene. And that is when they tied this double murder to the murders of the McCanns and the 2 women in the bar. The police knew at that time, we've got killers on a spree here. In the fall of 1978, the brothers had a fight. Thaddeus had a conscience, and he decided he didn't want to participate in any more murders. Gary was having money troubles, as always, so on December 4th, he robbed and killed 56-year-old Joseph Anick. 4 days later, he was caught trying to use Joseph's credit card to make a purchase. That's when they took him into custody. When Gary was in police custody, he began to talk. He told on his brother, and Thaddeus was arrested a week later. The brothers were both charged with 10 counts of murder and aggravated theft. They would later abandon their confessions and insist they were innocent, but it was far too late. Cops found the murder weapons at the men's apartments, as well as a number of objects stolen from the victims. Both brothers were convicted and sent to prison. Gary was later transferred to Lima State Hospital after engaging in deviant behavior. He later died of heart disease in 2004. Thaddeus died much earlier in 1989 from lung cancer. He was only 52. These two serial spree killers are sometimes referred to as the 22 caliber killers, but there are also other killers with that moniker. Brothers who become such vicious killers make a good argument for those who believe that some people are just born bad. Joseph Douglas Ball was born in January of 1896 to a wealthy farm and general store owner. He's known in popular culture as Joe Ball. One of his 7 siblings, a brother, would become the first mayor of Elmendorf, Texas. Joseph served in the front lines during World War I and then became a bootlegger during Prohibition. He opened a saloon he called the Sociable Inn in Elmendorf, Texas, that did quite well and made him a lot of money. With some of that money, Joseph builds a large pond and 5 alligators to live in that pond. He would then charge people to come and see the alligators, and there were large crowds willing to shell out a few bucks to watch the gators, especially at feeding time. What were they feeding the alligators? Live dogs and cats. That is awful. We have really changed the way we view our domestic pets. I cannot even imagine feeding a dog or a cat to an alligator. It actually gives me chills. Sadly, cats and dogs were not the only thing Joe Ball had no empathy for. He was a vicious man who liked to kill things. He enjoyed feeding live things to his alligators, and he was known to stand by the pond smiling and enjoying the horrified reactions of people who had paid him money for the pleasure. And then women in the area started disappearing. Barmaids in the area started to go missing. After several disappearances, word began to get around that Joe Ball had been seen flirting with or arguing with most of the women who ended up disappearing. And speaking of those disappearances, why weren't any of the women ever found? Their families hadn't heard from them. These are women with jobs and families and friends, and then one day they just up and vanish, never to be seen again. Why weren't their bodies being found? Well, a theory began to form. Everyone knew that Joe Ball liked to kill things, so 2 Bexar County Sheriff's deputies went to talk to Joe. It made sense to question him. He was known to be a bit off, to be strange, and he was known to be abusive to women. He was also the only guy in the area that owned 5 alligators. Alligators that could easily eat human beings whole, leaving absolutely zero evidence behind. So the 2 sheriff's deputies arrive at Joe Ball's saloon to talk to him. Joe sees them coming through the front door. By the looks on their faces, he knows they're there for him. Joe takes out a handgun from the cash register drawer, put it to his chest, and pulled the trigger, shooting himself in the heart. He died at the scene. This was all anyone needed to know. Joe was a serial killer, taking and murdering women in the area. Later on, a handyman named Clifford Wheeler came forward and told police that he'd helped Joe Ball dispose of 2 women that he had killed. Joe had murdered Minnie Goddard in June of 1937, and later Hazel Brown, known as Shotzi. Clifford got 2 years in prison for accessory to murder. The alligators, they were donated to the San Antonio Zoo. If this story sounds familiar to you, it's because Tobe Hooper later made a movie about Joe Ball. The film is called Eaten Alive, and it's about a serial killer who runs a hotel and feeds the bodies of his victims to his pet crocodile. I watched it to get ready for this episode, and it is a 1980s cheesy love fest for horror lovers. Put it on your watch list if you want to see people get eaten by alligators. This next story is tragic all the way around. Robert Nixon was born in 1990 in Tallulah, Louisiana. He had a lower than average IQ and experienced a lot of bullying and racism as a child. In April of 1937, 48-year-old Edna Warden and her 12-year-old daughter, Marguerite, were murdered in their apartment in the Bunker Hill neighborhood of Los Angeles. Both mother and daughter had been sexually assaulted and then murdered with a brick taken from a nearby building. Cops were able to match the brick to the exact location where it had been picked up. In March of the following year, 20-year-old mother Rose Valdez was raped and murdered in her bedroom while her baby slept in the crib just feet away. As these crimes were discovered and investigated, police linked them to 3 other sexual assaults in the area, and all of those assaults had been committed by a young black man. So these were women that survived, and they reported their to the police. All 3 women described the same man. So the police believe they've got a serial predator in the area that's women and killing some of them. On January 25th, 1938, a woman identified only as Mrs. H.W. Crow was attacked by a young black man wielding a brick. Mrs. Crow was inside Montesano Hospital when she was accosted and struck by the man holding a brick. A week later, a woman named Elizabeth Reese was relaxing in her Los Angeles hotel room when an intruder broke into her room and began hitting her with a brick. She survived but had a fractured skull, and she suffered with repercussions of the attack throughout her life. Elizabeth told the police that her attacker was a young black man who didn't seem to understand what she was saying when she tried to talk him out of hurting her. Weeks later, a woman named Zoe Drammel was viciously attacked and almost killed in her home. Zoe was unconscious for days, but when she awakened, she told the police that her attacker was a young black man holding a brick. Some of these women were even able to give sketches and very detailed descriptions, and the police knew they were looking for the same man. It is known that Robert Nixon then left Los Angeles and went to Chicago. He had only been there a few weeks when another murder occurred. On the night of May 27th, 1938, Florence Johnson, the wife of a Chicago fireman, was found dead in her home while her husband was at work. She had been struck multiple times on the head. Police found bits of mortar and brick embedded in her scalp. Florence's sister lived in an adjoining apartment and watched as 2 assailants left the house. The sister gave a description to the police, and one of the men's description matched that of the black man described in previous attacks. Police were sent to canvass the entire area. Extra cops were called into work, and they stopped everyone walking on the sidewalks. As they did this, they came across a young black man who was covered in blood and had scratches all over his hands. Robert Nixon was taken into custody. Immediately, he blamed his accomplice, 19-year-old Earl Hicks, for Florence's murder. He said the 2 went to rob her, and Earl killed the woman when she woke up and started screaming. The cops kept Robert talking. He then confessed to killing 24-year-old Florence Thompson Castle, a nightclub hostess, in her hotel room back in 1936. The cops knew of this murder because it was notorious. Why? The killer had taken Florence's lipstick and written the words Black Legion Game on the mirror in the room. The Black Legion was a domestic terrorist group. They hate Catholics, they hate Jews, they hate black people, pretty much everyone. But Robert Nixon didn't realize when he took the lipstick and wrote on the mirror, he'd left behind his fingerprints. The cops had those fingerprints on file, and they matched Robert's. Robert then admitted he had written the message on the mirror. Robert Nixon also confessed to attacking Zoe Drammel. Police then matched Robert's fingerprints to those found at the double murder scene of the Wardens, but they failed to link him to other crimes he is suspected of. Now, this is when all the racism ramped up, because don't you know, white people never commit crimes. Ever, you guys, ever. White people commit far more crimes than any other group. There are more white people than any other group in America. It's math, my friends. And as I say here over and over, there are bad people in every race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, ethno-religious group. There are bad people in every sect of society. But the white people at the time were mostly racists, and they were demanding that Robert Nixon be lynched. The media also horrifically dubbed him the Brick Moron, a terrible and ableist name, labeling this man a derogatory word because of his reduced intelligence. A crowd of angry white people appeared at the police station and had to be contained by the cops. Robert Nixon had to be held at a secret location for his own safety. He was held in custody and continued to confess. Robert told the cops that he had and murdered a nursing student named Antone Costa in 1937, and he told them he'd attacked 3 additional women in Chicago as well. Later at Robert's trial, the Supreme Court would throw these confessions out, stating that Robert Nixon had been severely beaten and abused by the police. There was no fingerprint evidence linking Robert to Florence Johnson's death, and there were witness statements that were contradictory. I'm not going to repeat the things the press has said about Robert Nixon. It's important to remember these stories and the ugliness that occurs in our society, but there are certain words I just don't want to repeat. I don't want it on my channel, but suffice it to say, they were terrible, horrific names and comparisons. Yes, I do think Robert Nixon committed some of these crimes. I don't know about all of them, but I do think he was a serial killer. That doesn't mean we dehumanize an entire sect of our population by using degrading names against a killer from that population. Bad people in every group, good people in every group. On January 27th, 1939, Earl Hicks, Robert Nixon's accomplice, was sentenced to 14 years in prison for Florence Johnson's death. Robert Nixon himself was sentenced to death. He was executed in the electric chair a year after his conviction on June 16th, 1939. He was only 19 years old. Antone Charles Costa, who went by Tony, was born on August 2nd, 1944 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was only 17 when he committed his first violent offense. He broke into a house and attacked the teenage girl who lived there. His sentence? 3 years probation. I'll spare you my usual song and dance about these young offenders who get no time and then go on to do much worse things later in life. We've got 5 stories to cover today, so I will spare you the rant. Tony Costa got married in 1963 and had 3 children, but after a few years, his wife had had it with his illegal drug use, and she divorced him. She took the children with her. The couple had been living in California, and when Tony's wife left him, he decided to move back to Cambridge. In the summer of 1968, he broke into a medical supply company and stole thousands of dollars worth of medical equipment. Then, on February 8th, 1969, 2 women disappeared. They were Patricia Walsh and Marianne Wysocki. The women were on a nature walk when Patricia's Volkswagen was found abandoned in the woods. As the police are searching for Patricia and Marianne, they come up on the remains of a woman named Susan Perry, who had been missing since September of 1968. She'd been missing for a year. Susan's body, I have to be somewhat careful of what I say here. She had been horribly mutilated and cut into 8 pieces. So imagine this. You're out looking for 2 missing women, and you find the mutilated body of another woman who is also missing. The police continued to search for Patricia and Marianne, and months after they disappeared, parts of Marianne's body were found in the woods. Then investigators found Patricia's body and the rest of Marianne's body in a forest clearing. Both women had been murdered with a gunshot wound to the head. But then the killer had taken a knife and mutilated their bodies, removing some of the pieces. Underneath the remains of Patricia and partial remains of Marianne, the police find another body. It was the body of another missing woman. The police were shocked to find the dismembered remains of Sydney Monson. Her body showed signs of necrophilia. The police knew they had a very serious problem on their hands, and they had an idea of who that problem might be. Tony Costa was known for using this very small area in the woods for growing pot plants. He'd been caught there, and people in the area were aware that Tony was tied to that area in the past. Not only that, Tony Costa knew all 4 of these women. All 4 dead women were acquaintances of Tony's. He'd either dated them or sold them pot or known them as friends, and people knew of this connection. So not smart at all on Tony's part. The police pull the interior of Patricia's Volkswagen van apart, and they do a complete forensic analysis on it. Inside the van, they find Tony Costa's fingerprints on the car's owner's manual, which they found in the woods. Somebody had taken the manual and thrown it into the woods. Slowly, details of these crimes begin to make their way to the media, and people are horrified at the facts. Both Patricia and Marianne's hearts had been removed from their bodies and taken away. He's an actual ghoul. Each body was cut in as many parts as there are joints in the body. Wherever there was a major joint, their body had been severed there. Then claims began to circulate that the bodies were covered in teeth marks. Those claims were later proven untrue, but there were parts cut away. Tony Costa was arrested and taken into custody. The press was all over this story. The victims were young women living kind of a hippie lifestyle. Then you had this pot growing and dealing divorced creeper who had reportedly done terrible things to their bodies. You know, it had everything that makes a good true crime story. So Kurt Vonnegut, the author, the writer, he got involved in this story because his own daughter, Edith, knew Tony Costa. Kurt compared Tony to Jack the Ripper in an article that he wrote for Life magazine in 1969. And then Kurt Vonnegut begins corresponding with Tony Costa as Tony sits in jail. And Tony is telling Kurt, I wouldn't hurt a fly. I'm innocent. But Kurt did not believe him. In May of 1970, Tony Costa was convicted for the murders of Patricia and Marianne, and he was sentenced to life in prison at Walpole Correctional Institution. 4 years later, he hung himself in his cell. Later, a manuscript written by Tony was revealed, and in that manuscript, he claims that he and a man named Carl were doing LSD and Dilaudid with Patricia and Marianne when Carl, for some unknown reason, pulls out a gun and shoots the women. When Tony realized that Marianne was still alive after being shot, he said he used a knife to end her suffering. So although reports of teeth marks on the body were proven to be untrue, where are the women's hearts? Is Tony Costa just a killer, or was he truly the Cape Cod cannibal? Friedrich Heinrich Karl Haarmann, who went by Fritz, thank goodness for me, was born on October 25th, 1879 in Hanover, German Empire. He was a quiet child and a strange child. He did not socialize or play well with other children, and his mannerisms were noticeably effeminate. He hated boys' activities and enjoyed playing more with his sisters, and in particular, he liked their dolls. He also liked dressing in his sister's clothing. So today we would say that perhaps Fritz was transgender, but I want to point out, like I always do, that behaviors uncharacteristic of either sex does not automatically mean a child is queer or trans. It just means maybe they express themselves uniquely. Fritz also got very good at needlework, and he loved to cook. He was the youngest child and had a particularly close relationship with his mother. Fritz's father had married his mother, who was much older, because of her wealth. And his father was an angry man who openly cheated on Fritz's mother. This man ends up getting syphilis, so concepts of thoughts and prayers there. When you're cheating, you get what you get. Fritz gets sent off to military school, but soon begins having fainting spells and is discharged from the school and the military. He worked in his father's cigar factory after that, but by 16, Fritz was committing sexual offenses against young boys. We would look at this in modern times as a homosexual boy who had an interest in other boys. But this was a long time ago. So Fritz was sent to a mental institution in Hildesheim in February of 1897 and was then deemed incurably deranged. In 1898, Fritz escaped the mental institution and with the help of his mother, fled to Zurich, Switzerland. He returned to Hanover in 1899, where he began a relationship with a woman who became pregnant. He then received notice that he was obligated to perform his compulsory military service. He was quickly discharged from the military for medical reasons, and he was labeled as having dementia praecox. This is an old-fashioned term used to describe deteriorating mental health. Fritz then attempted to open a fishmonger business, but then the woman he had gotten pregnant terminated their engagement, and because the business was registered in her name, she simply ordered Fritz off the premises. For the next 10 years, Fritz worked as a thief and a con artist. When he was employed for short periods of time, he stole from his employers. He was convicted in 1913 for theft and sentenced to 5 years. When he got out, Fritz was put on an actual list. There was an actual list of area known homosexuals. I find this... History is sometimes an ugly place. Nobody should have cared a single bit about his homosexuality. They should have been focused on his thievery and assaults of young boys, which is called pedophilia, not homosexuality. We don't ever conflate the two as being the same. Fritz was not a mentally well man at all, and it wasn't long before he went totally off the rails. Between 1918 and 1924, Fritz is known to have committed 24 murders, and he is suspected of committing 27. All of the victims were male, and they were between the ages of only 10 and 22. The majority of his victims were in their mid-teens. So this is pedophilia. This is an unhealthy and depraved attraction to children. Fritz's MO went like this. He would lure these young boys back to his apartment with promises of alcohol or with promises of employment, because little kids worked back then. It was horrific. Once the boys were inside his home, Fritz would feed them and give them wine. Then Fritz would attack the boys in a very disturbing manner. He would lunge at them and get on top of them. He would then take his teeth and bite down on the Adam's apple in the boy's throat. And he would hold his teeth there until the boys suffocated to death. Literally like a dog, literally the way a wolf or a large cat would kill its prey. It is one of the most unusual methods of killing I have ever heard of. I had never heard of this before. A killer that bites on the throat until the person suffocates. The victims would die of asphyxiation. On several occasions, Fritz bit completely through his victim's Adam's apple and trachea. He would later tell investigators it was his, quote, love bite. When the boys were dead, Fritz would dismember their bodies and take the pieces to the Leine River. It later comes out that Fritz started killing in 1918, and his first victim was a 17-year-old boy named Friedel Roth. When Friedel disappeared, friends told police they'd last seen him with Fritz, and the police went to Fritz's apartment, where they found him with a half-naked 13-year-old boy. He gets 9 months in prison for that, and Fritz would later brag that when the police came to his apartment and caught him with this 13-year-old boy, the head of Friedel was wrapped in newspaper and hidden behind his stove. So not only was he killing people in the most unusual way, he was dismembering them and keeping their heads. When Fritz got out of prison, he started a relationship with 18-year-old Hans Grons, who he claims he originally planned to pimp out. Instead, the two became lovers, but Fritz became aware that Hans mocked him to friends, and the couple's relationship turned very tense. He and Hans stayed together because Hans was basically homeless and Fritz craved this younger man's attention. Hans would later become Fritz's accomplice after walking in on Fritz with a dead and naked woman on his bed. Well, that's got to be awkward. You just, what do you say in a situation like that? Fritz's sister began meeting with Fritz and she convinced him to confess. In the end, Fritz admitted to killing, and dismembering many young men between 1918 and 1924. He said he had a rabid sexual passion he could not control. Fritz claimed he hated the dismemberment and was sick for days after he engaged in it, but that the desire to kill was stronger than his dislike of cutting up the bodies. Fritz actually ends up giving the police a very detailed description of his dismemberment process. It involves a bucket and a bundle of straw used to wrap the head in before pulverizing it with a sledgehammer. When asked how many victims he had, Fritz replied between 50 and 70. His trial began on December 4th, 1924. He was charged with the murder of 27 boys. 10 days later, he was found guilty of 24 of the 27 murders, and he was sentenced to death by beheading. Fritz said, "I shall go to the decapitating block joyfully and happily." On April 15th, 1925, Fritz was taken to the guillotine at 6 a.m. He was given a cup of Brazilian coffee and an expensive cigar to smoke. He then said, "I am guilty, gentlemen, but hard though it may be, I want to die as a man." Just before the blade fell, he said, "I repent, but I do not fear death." Sections of Fritz's brain were removed for forensic analysis. His brain showed traces of meningitis. The murders stirred a wave of homophobia throughout Germany, and the case brought out the bigots who are always looking for the wrong things to blame, when the truth of the matter will always be that throughout history, no matter the technology or lack thereof, no matter the methods of communication, whether the killers are gay, straight, or in between, black, white, brown, it does not matter. The monsters come from every faction of our culture and every sect of our society. And the hardest truth of all, they walk among us undetected. Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. I hope you enjoyed that episode and maybe learned something you didn't know before. I know I did. I love these obscure stories. If you would you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already? It helps a lot. You know, I've got 2 podcasts. This one is Dining with Death. It's an archival series. It's just the audio taken from old videos posted here on YouTube. There are some really good stories there. This is the current podcast, Dark Hearts. It is on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon. I post new episodes every Monday and every Wednesday. And if you have time, would you leave me a review? I mean, preferably a 5-star one, but just saying. I want to thank my patrons, especially. Some of you very generously donate a few dollars a month to help me keep the episodes coming, and I appreciate you so much. You know, we've got a fundraiser going. I know it's Christmas, and I know money is tight, but if you are going to donate a few bucks to a charity, would you consider our fundraiser? Our community raises money to donate to police departments so cold case kits that have not been tested can be tested. If you watch this short little video, it explains everything we're doing and all the ways you can donate. $5 from a lot of people goes a long way. I keep a spreadsheet with everybody's name, donation date, and donation amount, and we're about halfway to our first goal. When we get there, we're going to vote on the case we want to help with. I sure hope you're well. I'm so happy you're part of my community. I love talking to you guys in the comments, and I think about you. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other, and I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.